Sister Jocelyn here, and welcome to another episode of Faith on the Journey. If this is your first time tuning in, we welcome you. We are so glad that you are here and want you to know that we're committed to helping you strengthen your faith, heal your heart, and discover a sense of community. And we do so through a variety of ways by connecting you with a team of Christian counselors and offering trauma healing trainings across the country. You can learn about these resources and so much more by visiting our website at faithonthejourney.org. Again, that is faithonthejourney.org. Now, today we are finishing up a powerful series on sexual abuse. Now, we've dealt with topics ranging from abuse within the church and misconduct. We've talked about childhood molestation. We've talked about how abuse, sexual abuse in particular, can impact our ability to experience intimacy within marriage last week. And today we're culminating our conversation by dealing with a sensitive topic, dealing with marital rape, how consent still matters in marriage. And I know for some of us, this might be difficult to address, but how many of us know that in order for us to heal, in order for us to have transformation within our lives and within the church and the body of Christ, we need to expose certain topics, which is why I'm very grateful to have our guest on the show today because she wrote a book on just that. Christine Hammond is a leading mental health and guest speaker from across the country. She's the author of an award winning book called The Exhausted Woman's Handbook and a book called Abuse Exposed. She has written over 500 articles on various topics around mental health. She has more than 1 million people downloading her podcast called Understanding Today's Narcissist and more than 400,000 views on YouTube. We got a heavy hitter in the house today. But more importantly, she's a believer. She loves the Lord, and she's going to help me engage in this important conversation today. So I'm so honored to welcome Christine to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate all that you are doing and helping women to be able to move forward, and men too, because remember, abuse happens to both men and women.
Yes, say that. Thank you. Thank you, Christine. And let's just kind of dive into this because you are someone who knows about the topic of abuse, unfortunately, too well. And this is something where you experience this even early on in your life. And so I would like for you to start off by just sharing a little bit about your story. And while doing so, you also mentioned in your book there is direct abuse and indirect abuse. So can you kind of explain how that actually factored into your story?
Absolutely. And so it's an example of like how we can take things that have happened in our past and we can either use them for good or we can use them for evil, right? And so I've chosen to use some of the things that happened to me in my past for good and helping other people to be able to move forward. And I was born to two parents where my father was an alcoholic and he was very abusive towards my mother. I witnessed multiple times of him beating my mother up. So that would be what we call indirect abuse. And then also times in which I also saw him hurt myself and even my brother as well. And the times that he hurt me, those were direct abuse. I was fortunate in that my mother decided to get a divorce from him for the safety of myself and my brother. And she did that, and we were able to live with my grandparents for a while. So I have a lot of like generational influences from them. And then she later remarried, and we were able to be raised by the man that I call my father now, because he did the bulk of the raising of my brother and I. And so I want to say, like, you are able to overcome. There is resilience in being able to move forward from having a traumatic experience in your past and from having experienced different types of abuse that you might have actually gone through. And there's so many different types of abuse. I know we're focusing today on sexual abuse, and so we'll stay in that genre.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. And now let's transition into the topic of the show with speaking to marital rape. What is this? Can you define it for us?
Absolutely. So, marital rape is like sex that you are having without consent, and it could be coerced, all right, which is that you are asked to do something that might be outside your comfort level, outside something that you feel is like natural for you or good for you. You might do it as a means of like financial gain, like maybe perhaps you're told if you do this, then you can have fill in the blank, whatever it is that you've been asked or that you're asking for. Or it might be like, if you do this for me, then I won't restrict your account, right? And so it's a combination, could be a combination of two different abuses happening at the same time. That is coercive sex. And when you have coercive sex, that is not consensual sex. Consensual sex is when the two of you agree to do something and you're both in mutual agreement with whatever that act is. And so within the bounds of marriage, like there's a wide range of sexual activity that you can have, and as long as it's agreeable with both of you and you're both comfortable doing it, there's nothing wrong with that. But when we come into problems is when it is coercive sex, which is the first step of like somebody's talking you into something that you don't want to do. And then there's also marital rape, which is like one step removed from that, which is now you are definitely saying no. You are clear about not wanting to engage in sex. And all of a sudden, your partner has decided that they are going to take advantage of you and have sex with you anyway. And that sex could be oral, it could be vaginal. So it could happen in a variety of different ways. But still, it is considered to be marital rape. It's happening within the bounds of marriage. Marriage is not an automatic guarantee for I can have sex whatever way I want. That's not the way it works. You have to still consent to it even within the bounds of a marriage.
Mhm, mhm. Consent matters.
It does matter. Yes.
Yes, and I wonder, in terms of narratives that might have been taught or beliefs that might have been instilled around the role of husband and wife in marriage, maybe, it's thought that, "Well, my body's not my own," for example, people might believe, or, that you must submit. Can we talk a little bit about maybe some theological worldviews that might contribute to someone's misdirected belief around the need for consent?
And I want to add, it's not just theological worldviews. It's within the confines of the church,
That's right.
unfortunately, for
You're
which
right.
like they are encouraging what I would call inappropriate sexual activity between a marriage partnership. And the problem that we have with that is, so I want to talk about the problem and then I'll go backwards. The problem that we have with that occurring is that they creates an imbalance, and it creates this imbalance that is not designed through a sexual activity. Sex is supposed to be mutually consenting, done for the benefit and pleasure of both parties involved. It's supposed to be something that you both agree to and you both enjoy. And so when you are doing that together, you are creating like a neutral territory. You are creating a balance of like mutual love and agreement and attachment and connection, and so it's a mutual process. So the problem with anything else that's not that is that it creates this imbalance of power where one person is exhibiting or demonstrating power over another person, which is the opposite of what sex is supposed to be. Sex is not designed to have power and control over somebody else. And so anything when we're talking about like you have to submit to me, taking that verse and using it in an inappropriate way, which, by the way, is spiritual abuse, just so we're clear.
Yes, it is. Amen
Yes,
to that, Christine.
that's
Yes.
right. So that is spiritual abuse when you take a verse like that and you say, you have to submit to me and do this sexual act, even though you're uncomfortable with it because I say you have to do it. And this is what the Bible says you have to do. That is not correct at all. And that is not what that passage was ever meant to convey. And so that is inappropriate ways, and that's within the church confines that they use it in an inappropriate way. Stepping outside of the church, I will say the biggest problem we have right now is the large use of pornography. And And when we're talking about pornography, that I call that like the worldview, right? That you can like look at pornography and there's nothing wrong with it and everything's fine with it. That is very much opposed to like what is within the church view of how we look at pornography. We look at that as somebody else is entering into a marital relationship. And so when you consider that to be what that is, like that's the worldview, like the worldview is like, oh, it's okay. And so within the confines of pornography, we have a lot of sex that's very inappropriate and a lot of sex that's very much power and control dominated. And everything from like very dangerous behaviors, even that are engaged in and demonstrated for other people and even encouraged for trying, like, and I'll just use an example of choking. Like choking and having sex at the same time is an example of something like that that's very dangerous. It's part of a worldview that is often displayed within the pornography realm, and people are doing this or engaging with it in hopes that they will have a better high or a heightened like arousal as part of their sexual experience. But this also goes against the power and control dynamic that I was talking about. That is not mutually gratifying for somebody who's on the receiving end of being choked. That, you know, while they're also engaging in a sexual activity, is very confusing, and it is abusive. So now we're adding an abusive element into a sexual experience that is not healthy, and goes against the way that sex was designed. Again, going back to how it was designed, sex was designed to be mutually gratifying to two people, and both partners should be at an equal level of that, with nobody having power and control over the other one.
Yes. We can't emphasize that enough, and I think that when we have all these dynamics at play, we have, like, the world, we have even within the church, some messages might be misunderstood or misused. It can create this dynamic where there's so much damage that can be done, and I remember reading in your book how none of us are exempt from being exposed to these narratives and being in some way impacted by abuse, even if we don't realize it. And I think that sometimes, as you mentioned, the porn, some of these messages, they're influencing our thought patterns and behaviors. And so awareness is key, right?
It is. It is absolutely. And like what's acceptable and what's okay. And so I want to make sure that we're clear. Like there are a lot of things that are acceptable within a marital realm as long as the two of you mutually agree. And it's a mutual agreeable environment. When it is not mutually agreeable, that's where the problem is. And to take that to another step, like one of the biggest concerns I have, and because I've seen this within church environments, is that like this encouragement of women needing to have sex for with their husbands when they're not comfortable doing so for whatever reason. And they may have had, because unfortunately the stats on women having sexual trauma is awful. And so like we're talking like 1 in 4 women have had sexual trauma, and 1 in 6 men have had sexual trauma. So if you look at that stat and you're taking a woman who's had sexual trauma and then you try to force them into having sex, you are re-triggering all of their trauma from the past, and you're creating a very horrible environment for them. And if they're not comfortable having sex, then what needs to happen is they need to get the help that they need in order to get there, rather than feeling pressured or demanded or being told that they have to do this for some reason. And the church, I feel like, does not do an adequate job in protecting women who have been sexually traumatized. In fact, I feel like they exploit that instead of like really working towards how can we help? How can we come alongside? How can we be a protective environment for these women so that they feel safe and so that they know what like a healthy relationship looks like and they're okay with it? Instead, the message that's conveyed to women is like, oh, you're married, you have to have sex with your husband.
Mhm, or the fact that it's just this is how they are, like, we can kinda excuse away certain behavior, which makes it all the worst, right? And so, I remember reading a blog, that's actually how I came across you, is you wrote a blog on immorality of marital rape. And you talk about a story where you came across some organization, I wonder if it was religious, who was saying that marital rape is not a thing. It's almost
Yep,
like some
it
people, I
was
think,
religious. Yes,
oh no, see,
unfortunately.
that's what I'm talking about, like
It's painful to say
it's
that.
so
Yeah.
painful, like, the belief that it's like an oxymoron. You cannot be raped if you're married. And I just think about the the fact that we really have work to do as the body of Christ, And so are there any other myths related to that? I have a hard time getting that word out, but you know what I mean. Any other myths that we can debunk that needs to be exposed? You write about exposing these things. What else might come to mind regarding that when you think about that story?
So when I think about that story, like one of the other myths that we need to do is like that the only counseling that you should get for this is Christian counseling. And so I want to encourage you, like not all Christian counselors are sex therapists as well. And there are a lot of really good sex therapists out there that can help a situation if a couple so needs it. And so, like, please look outside of just the Christian realm because we not all Christians can do all things, and not all are trained in all areas. And so, like, one of those myths is that. One of the other myths is like, oh, I can just go talk to my pastor and he can solve everything. That's not necessarily true. Like, sometimes you do need more in depth work and you need to uncover like what's behind things. Not all reasons for not wanting to engage sex have to do with like past trauma. It could be within the marital relationship itself. There could be other problems that are existing that need to be addressed, because sex for a woman has everything to do with emotional connection. And so, if they are not feeling emotionally connected, it's going to be very difficult for them to engage sexually. That's not necessarily true for men. And so because of that just very biological difference that exists between men and women, I'm not trying to be stereotypical. For some men, it is more emotional than it is physical. For some women, it's more physical than men. But like in general speak, like it does exist in that way. And so because of that, like if there lacks an emotional connection, and then there's this demand or expectation for sex, we're back in the coercion power dynamic that is very unhealthy in a marriage. And for those that are finding themselves, they're hearing this and they're like, oh my gosh, that's what I have this unhealthy power dynamic going on in my marriage, and it's playing out in my sex life. Please do not dismiss this, because it is like a mold that just grows and gets worse and worse and worse as the years go on, to the point that you don't wind up engaging in sex at all. Somebody winds up having an affair. Like it turns into something else later on as a result of that. So please don't dismiss this or pass it off as being nothing, because it is something, and it does almost always get worse, not better, from where you're at right now. And so that's another myth that I would say, like, is if I just ignore this, it will get better with time. No. Ignoring things does not necessarily mean that they're going to get better with time. Almost always, they wind up getting worse with time. What does get better with time is, like, for instance, like the need to forgive somebody. Like, forgiveness does get easier and better with time for most people. A lot of people can't forgive immediately or right away, they need some time and space to do so. Patience is another thing that gets better with time. The harder you work on being patient with somebody, the better it gets with time. So there are some things that do get better with time, but sexual problems that exist within your marriage, if they are ignored, they do not get better with time. They only get worse from here. And then I also want to say one more thing. Like, there's another component that we often don't talk about as well, is a hormonal component. And so the hormonal component is that, as people age, their hormones change. And as your hormones change, hormonal therapy or replacement is not always appropriate or available or even good for everybody to take. And so therefore their sex drive is naturally going to change and diminish as they age and as they get older. This is not unusual. This is a normal part of our bodies aging, normal part of the process. And so please don't immediately jump to, like, this person is just doing this to get back at me, if they won't engage in sex, or like this person has to do it because we're married, or there's a power and control dynamic that's at play. Like, please also look to other things. Like, there could be an underlying medical reason for this, or an underlying hormonal reason. There could be some kind of chemical imbalance that's going on that needs to be addressed before we can address the sexual side of it.
That's very helpful. And so I have some follow-up questions, and it's really related to, okay, we got some stuff going on in this marriage. We got some sexual abuse happening, power dynamics, all the stuff that you're speaking to. We need to talk to both individuals right now. Imagine they were like in your room and you're like seeing all the stuff that's happening in your counseling, office. How would you first try to speak to the person who is actually being abusive to their partner?
So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a zone of safety before and above anything else. And so usually when I come across something like this in a counseling environment, I have everybody agree that okay, we're not going to engage or try to engage in sex for a period of time. And we all agree to what that time period is. So let's just pretend for our discussion purposes, we've agreed to a 30-day break, and we're just going to do a 30-day break to reset, to get some counseling, to figure out what's going on in the relationship. And so during that time period, then I work with both of them. Like, I work with the person who says, like, I feel like I'm being taken advantage of, to find out, okay, what's really going on underneath this? Like, where is it coming from? What's happening? What are your thoughts? What are the triggers? Like, what is your experience? And then I work with the other person and say, oh, why don't you tell me like what you know about the situation from your spouse? Because sometimes they do know, sometimes they're completely clueless, and they don't know at all. They haven't thought about it from their spouse's point of view. So the most important thing to start off with is, like, we have to create a zone of safety. Then we have to start looking at things from not only our own point of view, but also from the point of view of our spouse as well, to see like what their experience might be. And only by doing those three things can we then come to the fourth of, like, okay, well, what can we agree to engage in, and how can we start to like rebuild a connection? What does that look like, because we have to reestablish a sense of trust and within the marriage, because the trust has been broken. And so trust is the foundation of all of your relationships. If you don't have trust in a relationship, you're not going to feel safe, you're not going to feel secure, and you're going to be emotionally detached from that person. So we have to reestablish trust as the foundation. And so that's where we work, is reestablishing a sense of trust in the relationship. And I will tell you, there's some times when I just look at people, I'm like, nope, I'm piecing out. Like, absolutely not. I will not engage. I refuse to actually do any help, because I believe it to truly be a dangerous situation. And I'm not afraid to say this is a dangerous situation. This isn't good. You need to be done.
Thank you. Thank you. And I know for some people might be like, "Oh my gosh, well, she's the therapist. We can't say these things." Well, okay, we recognize the danger here. And it's very real. People lose their lives over things like this. Lives are destroyed, even if they're physically not dead. Abuse, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, it kills the spirit. And so when we see these things, you are alarmed. And I think you also speak to something that is very difficult sometimes for people in the church to agree with or acknowledge, that sometimes this needs to end. We know divorce is not something that is promoted per se, but in certain cases, it does need to end. And so, can you speak a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So when we're talking about, like, first of all, like the very basics of why something needs to end is the safety concern. Like, if we have a safety concern, somebody's safety, their welfare, their life is in danger in some way, shape, or form. And if we have marital rape going on, I would argue that there's a safety issue right there. Like, there's a huge, because it didn't start off as marital rape, but it escalated to that. And so if it's escalated to that, how much more is it going to escalate to? And where on earth are we going to draw that line? Like, what does that look like? If we're already okay with marital rape, like, where are we drawing the line where they actually pull out a knife and try to kill us? Like, I don't know. Like, so you have to know where that line is, and you have to be very clear about what does that line look like. And so safety is a very important component to it. So if a person is unable to feel safe, if there's a concern that their life is in danger in any way, shape, or form, absolutely, it needs to end. Like there's no doubt in my mind that that's an end for a marriage.
Mhm, mhm, and I think the unfortunate thing though, individual who is being victimized in a marriage, their beliefs around divorce being a sin, unforgivable, like all the again, theology, embedded beliefs, they might stay because they want to be, I'm speaking from a female perspective, a good wife, or they might feel like, "Oh, well, I don't wanna displease God," and so how do you unpack that with a client if you're working with them and they realize I'm unsafe in this and I think this needs to end, but I don't want to displease God?
The way I unpack that for them is sometimes through real life examples of people who have stayed, and unfortunately, we have like plenty of news stories to turn to where we see like murder suicides that have happened. Like most of the violence that happens are happening with people that we know and that we're intimate with, and not people that are complete strangers. That's a very rare occurrence, and so it's easy to pull up statistics to actually show that what the reality of the situation is. If you are staying in a relationship that is unsafe and your physical safety is being threatened in some way, shape, or form, like you need to get out, because otherwise you could wind up as one of those news stories later on. So we start with like a reality check of like, okay, here's what the reality actually is. Then if I have to go to scripture, what I do is I like there's a whole long list in Proverbs, and forgive me because I can't remember exactly where it is in Proverbs, but it says these are the things that God hates. Right. And if you look at the things that God hates or God detests, it's funny that not one of those is divorce. And so I have people look back over that list, because what is embedded in all of those things that God hates and dislikes is like people being taken advantage of, people being abused, people using God incorrectly or using God against other people. Like these are the things that God hates. So if we're talking about the things that he hates, and there's like degrees of God detests this or hates that or hate, like he hates this too. Like hello, he hates the abuse too. So
Yes.
like it, he already hates the abuse. So why are you going to keep staying in a situation that potentially could cost your life if he already hates the abuse that's happening to you?
Yes, yes, come on. Very, very real. And looking at it from that perspective, understanding that God hates abuse and that the covenant is being broken as well by the person who's being abusive, because that's not loving, that's not honoring, and so all these things. And so it takes some time to unpack that. We unfortunately don't have enough time on the show for that. But I do want to transition to one thing I was reading in your book that I gravitated to, and this is for someone who is being victimized or is a survivor of an abusive relationship, and that is understanding the role that you might have played in that situation, which is very sensitive because we're not saying that they're raging against you or being angry and acting crazy towards you is necessarily your fault for triggering them and them having that response. But you also talk about knowing the role. Can you unpack that for me?
Everybody has a responsibility in how they got to where they are, right? And by responsibility I mean like you've allowed certain things or certain boundaries to be overstepped. So let's just pretend for a hot second that your boundary is nobody's ever going to yell at me or call me a name. Okay, well, if your spouse yells at you and calls you a name, then they've already overstepped that boundary. So then what's your next boundary? Like, and why are you letting the next boundary happen? Like, and if you keep allowing the boundary to keep moving and keep moving and keep moving, and you become tolerant and you allow it to happen, well, then that's your contribution to it. And maybe you don't know what the boundary is. Like maybe you've never thought about, where are my boundaries? What is the limit that I'm willing to set? And so I this is not a very popular philosophy, but I'm going to say it anyway. I ask people when they're in a marriage relationship, what are the deal breakers of your marriage? Because if you don't know what the deal breaker of your marriage is, then that gives the other person the right to do whatever. So, like, if your deal breaker is, I am going to be totally intolerant if and the marriage will end if you have sex with somebody else. Okay, well, that's a boundary. You're allowed to have that boundary. And if that's your boundary, that's fine. But you need to know that that's what your boundary is. And you need to be able to communicate that that's what your boundary is. And then if your spouse oversteps that boundary, then you have to be willing to take it to the next step, which is your responsibility and your contribution of saying, okay, either the marriage is done or we'll go to counseling or whatever it is that you're willing to do next. But to ignore it, not pay attention to it, not acknowledge that a boundary has been overstepped, well, then that becomes your contribution to the problem. And then that person is like, oh, well, they didn't really say anything about the last affair. So, hey, I'm going to go have a couple dozen more. And it happens. And so that's why I say like that is your responsibility in it, is to know what your boundaries are. And your boundaries are going to be a lot born in your childhood trauma and your own personal experiences more than anything else. So like if you have been cheated on before in the past, you might have a very low tolerance for being cheated on in the future. That's okay. You're allowed to have your boundary. Like you are allowed to have your boundary wherever that is, as long as you communicate it and you both understand what that boundary is. Now I'm going to use a boundary that sometimes is used that we need to like have more conversation around. So a boundary, for instance, is like you're sitting at a restaurant and your spouse happens to notice somebody else who's attractive and glances their way and then glances back over at you. If your boundary is the relationship ends because like they've done that, I'm going to challenge you on that boundary a little bit to like do a little bit more work, because I feel like that's like taking advantage and that's controlling on your part, right? And so that becomes problematic in and of itself. So like some the boundaries have to be mutually agreeable.
Mhm, mhm. Definitely. Oh, there's so much to talk about. I'm struggling to, like, not just go deep on all these things that you're saying, but very helpful. So I want to ask my next question is around, your voice, the Holy Spirit, your intuition, your gut. I think that one of the things that someone who might find themselves in an abusive, situation, an abusive marriage, is they have ignored their voice. The voice is saying, "No, this is not okay." Blah, blah, blah. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. So I have found that over and over again. Like, there's kind of like a dulling of that voice, that inner voice that's inside of you that says, this is wrong. You shouldn't do this. And you like don't listen to it and don't listen to it. And that voice gets quieter, quieter, quieter. And then what winds up happening is that the person has this like flat affect about them. They have lost like the life inside of them. They've lost who they are, because they haven't listened to who they really are on the inside. And then that starts to reflect on the outside. So it becomes an outward appearance. One of my favorite books, it's not a Christian book, but I will say what it is. It's called The Gift of Fear. And I love this book, and I ask people to read this book when I find that they are not listening to their inner voice. And the reason why I ask them to listen to or to read the book is because this book really talks about the importance of, like, we tend to think of emotions as like, good or bad emotions, and emotions are neither good nor bad. It's what we do with the emotion that makes it good or bad. And so like fear can be a good emotion to have, and when you are afraid of something, you need to pay attention to what's going on behind that. And so like if you feel like somebody is approaching you from behind and you immediately become afraid, don't ignore that. Like, by all means, turn around, pay attention, like eyes wide open as to like what's going on in that situation. And I'll share this story, real life story of a client of mine who came to see me. She was traumatized because she had been beaten up and almost raped. As a result of not paying attention to this fear. She had left her apartment building. She was going out to her car in a parking garage, and she immediately felt afraid and she felt scared. Didn't see anything on the offset, but didn't also do anything about it. Then she saw somebody approaching her, and even though she felt very fearful at that moment, she ignored it. She pushed it aside and she said, no, there's nothing wrong with that person. I don't need to be afraid of them. But then that was the person that attacked her. And so I say this like because like we have this God-given ability to like sense things, and please use it by all means. Like it is a gift. It is not something to run away from or to ignore. And but the more you ignore it and the more you don't pay attention, the more duller it becomes. And you don't hear that any longer inside of you. And so it's very important to pay attention to that inner voice and to hear it and to like listen to it. Now, we don't want to take fear to the umpteenth degree where we're afraid to leave our house because like we're afraid we're going to get a germ on us and die. So like that's an unhealthy use of fear, right? So we talk about healthy use and unhealthy use. That's an unhealthy use of fear that needs to be dealt with, therapeutically so that you can work through that. But a healthy dose of fear is a good thing that we need to pay attention to.
Mhm, mhm. And with that, with understanding the importance of your voice and learning it again. Maybe you've just been ignoring it for so long. Now you're like, "Well, what do I think?" Let's talk about the process of rediscovering self-healing. Whether you stay in the marriage or not, what are some things that you can do if you're a survivor of sexual abuse to begin to heal, to begin to reclaim your voice?
One of the things that you can do is you can have to start listening to yourself, right? And you have to know what your thoughts are. And journaling is one of my favorite methods for actually rediscovering what you're experiencing. And we're not just journaling about like the events of the day. I did this or I did that. It's more like journaling the thoughts and journaling the emotions that you're experiencing. What I find that a lot of times is we don't even know what we're feeling in any given moment. And yet, in any given moment, we should have at least about three emotions that are floating around at any time in our lives. And so we might be excited, we might have a little bit of anxiety, we might feel a little stressed. And that's normal to have all of those things that you're experiencing at the same time. But if we're not aware that we're experiencing it, well, then that becomes a problem. And that also is the deadening. So part of like listening to yourself is becoming self-aware of like the things that you are feeling, but also the things that you are internally saying to yourself in your head. Like what are the things that you are repeating over and over and over again? If you are repeating in your head, which happens a lot with people who've been sexually traumatized, that they are not good enough in some way, or that they should have done something, or that this is their fault, or if only they had done this, then this wouldn't have happened to them. Those are common things that they say. And so when you start to realize, okay, this is what I'm saying in my head, I call it the best friend test. Would you say to your best friend that they are not good enough and that's why this happened to them? And if you wouldn't say that to your best friend, then you shouldn't say it to yourself. And so it's a really quick test that you can do to kind of challenge some of those automatic thoughts that might be unhealthy and dysfunctional that are floating around in your brain. And once you start to become more aware of the emotions that you're experiencing in the moment, being very present and very aware, and you start to become more aware of the thoughts that are circulating in your head, well, now it becomes easier to listen to like that inner voice that's telling you, hey, let's pay attention to this, or hey, like I think you would really enjoy that, or hey, I feel like my boundary is being pushed in this area. Like it becomes much, much easier to pay attention to those things.
Mhm, mhm. And for the individual who might be listening to this and it's like a revelation, "Wow, I've been abusive to my spouse."
Mm,
What
yeah.
does healing and transformation look like for them?
So when if you've become aware that you might have been abusive to your spouse, the first thing you have to do is start to figure out why. Like your big number one job is to figure out how you got here in the first place. We don't get here by accident. And so like what events in your own life had led up to where you are right now. So it requires a lot of self-reflection, for you to do as an abuser, to say, hey, this is how I wound up getting here. These are the things that I have done that have contributed to the problem. Once you recognize what those things are, so you have like your own like inventory that you have done of yourself, then you can start the process of apologizing. So I don't like the apologizing first, I like the apologizing second, after you become aware, because because in your awareness, you're going to discover other things that you might not have thought of before. If we're so quick to jump to an apology without really doing the reflection first, then the apology sometimes comes off as like half hearted, or like you might not really be very apologetic for all of it. You might be apologetic for like a third of it, and then two-thirds is like missing because you haven't done the reflection that you really need to ahead of it. So I ask for reflection first. Please get into therapy and find out like help to discover like what caused you to get here in the first place. Like and what traumas do you have that you might need to recover from, that you might have buried in your own past and are covering up through this like power and control dynamic that needs to go away. And then after you've done all of your own self work, then go to the person that you have done some harm to and apologize, because you will come from a whole different area of really atoning for what you have done. Much better than like, let's quickly jump to an apology and push it aside and pretend it didn't happen and move forward from here. Like, that's not how we handle it.
Mhm, mhm. That's so helpful, and I would love to just spend more time with you, but I know we need to wrap this up. So, if you were to have any final words of encouragement or advice around this healing journey, whether it's for the person who's been abusive or has been being abused in the relationship, what are any final words, advice that you can offer to help them on their healing path forward?
So if you are listening to this and you're realizing I have experienced marital rape as part of my relationship, and you've reached out to people within your church and you have not found support and help for it, please keep looking. Like, please keep looking somewhere else and get the support and the help that you need. Don't just stop and just say, okay, well, I can't go anyplace else. Like, this is what my church says about it, and I just need to be okay with it. Listen to that inner voice inside of you that's telling you this is wrong, this isn't appropriate, and go find some help somewhere else. So that's the big piece number one, like find the right help for you. The big piece number two is like everything can get better, and if you work at it. And so, unfortunately, it takes work for us to get better in some regards, but the willingness to work and the motivation to do the work will actually turn things around for you. Whether you're turning around a relationship, whether you're recognizing that your own life needs to just move forward, in whatever regard it is, like if you do the work of it, you will actually be able to move forward and be in a much healthier environment. And at the end of the day, like that's really what we want. We want believers to feel, to be healthy and to be a healthy expression, because we can't properly reflect Christ in our own lives if we are unhealthy ourselves and if we are in an unhealthy relationship. And that's probably the big number three, is like if you're staying because you think that you're reflecting Christ and you are in like this power and control dynamic, you are not reflecting Christ. And you might not be aware of that, but you really are not. And it doesn't matter what role you play in the church. If that's the underlying dynamic you've got going on, you are not doing an accurate reflection, and that's not a healthy representation, and is not something that we want even in the church in and of itself, because we want healthy people within the church.
We do. Thank you, Christine, for exposing this abuse. And this just you're just a wealth of knowledge. And I would love for people to know how to get in touch with you to learn more about your work.
Thank you. Yes, you can go to my website. It's Grow with Christine. So it's GROW with WITH, Christine, CHRISTINE.com. And so you can go to my website. It has the books listed there, it has the articles, my podcasts. It also has how to reach me at my office.
Thank you. Thank you for being a guest, Christine.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Faith on the Journey. My God, we touched on a very, very difficult but necessary topic. And if you know someone who has experienced any form of sexual abuse within their marriage, I encourage you to share this episode with them. Also, if you were blessed by today's episode, be sure to subscribe if you're watching on YouTube and leave a 5-star review if you're listening on Apple Podcast. One thing I do want to remind you before we go, as Christine mentioned, do not go through this healing journey alone. There are people who are qualified to help and support you. And thankfully, our team of Christian counselors actually do have an understanding of this dynamic and can provide the type of care you need if you are a sexual trauma survivor with the intersection of God's word, but also trauma informed care. And so we would love for you to consider us if you need some additional support as you begin to heal and move forward on your journey. So that is it for this week's episode, family. Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, you stay encouraged and you keep your faith on the journey. I'll see you soon, family.